Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sulani Madsen. I'm finally back online after 2 weeks battling flu, fever, and a lingering cough. I'll apologize in advance if I have to take a swig of water to keep my voice working. I managed to keep up with the weekly columns while quarantining at home, which is not much different than normal life on the ranch, except with lots of honey lemon tea and more naps. For this edition of Forthright, I'm covering the most recent column. It's the most time critical now that the Washington legislature is in session. So, published Thursday, January 12th, 2023 in the Spokesman Review, Emergency Powers Need Transparency and Humility. Leaders who lead with humility and transparency are never more valuable than during an emergency, when hard decisions must be made quickly and maintaining trust is critical. Both were conspicuously missing from the recently ended 975-day state of emergency, where it wasn't about leaders, plural, but a one-man show that dragged out way too long. It's why emergency powers reform is essential in this legislative session. Senate Bill 5063 is lead sponsored by Senator Linda Wilson, Republican of Vancouver, and Senator Mark Mullet, Democrat of Issaquah, as a bipartisan bill to require legislative consent to continue a state of emergency after the first 30 days. The bill has 10 co-sponsors, including Senator Shelley Short, Republican of Addy, and Senator Jeff Holy, Republican of Cheney. It's not revolutionary. It does not change the breadth of the governor's authority or duty to act in an emergency, although there are voices in the conservative movement who believe the current grant of authority goes too far. We can't foresee every future event. In a dire emergency, when time is of the essence, broad authority by a single person may be necessary to deal with novel situations. But novelty wears off, and one day it is no longer an emergency. Urgent, perhaps, but not hair on fire call 911 emergency. The problem is the only person who can end the state of emergency is the same one who called it, the governor. It's an invitation to petty tyranny in a constitutional system that in every other governance situation provides for legislative checks on executive power. 18 months into his declared state of emergency, Governor Jay Inslee said this on the September 29, 2021 TVW program The Impact, and I quote, "There is only one person in the state of Washington who has the capability to save those lives right now, and it happens to be the governor of the state of Washington," end quote. A governor who speaks of himself in the third person with godlike powers is not someone acting with humility. Lacking humility, transparency is even more vital to building public trust. Who is the governor listening to? Given that everyone was on a COVID learning curve, what were the trade-offs being made? Regularly consulting with legislative leadership would have made a difference in building public trust. It didn't happen. Legislative involvement is a way to insert real-time oversight into the executive decision-making process. SB5063 at least provides a means for the legislative leadership to declare an end to a state of emergency after 90 days, unless the governor provides convincing justification. But it doesn't go far enough to require legislative involvement during the emergency. Lacking anyone in the room when decisions are made on their behalf, the public is left to pick over the internal documents now dribbling out through the media to see what happened. Emails are shedding light on how information was weighed, discarded, or used to rationalize preferred courses of action. Those inclined to rant to the defense of Democrats, of course, characterize the document autopsy as a search for conspiracy. Apparently, they would prefer nobody looks, nobody questions. That's not happening. Decisions made out of sight create curiosity. One of those questionable decisions from the governor was the August 2021 mandate for state employees to receive the original COVID vaccine. Despite an increasing pattern of breakthrough cases, putting public benefits at doubt, as well as a growing understanding of individual risks and the impacts on state agency staffing. Transparency via public records disclosure request is not only delayed but frustratingly slow. The first batch I received was of more recent documents like this email from July 1st on the effect the emergency mandate was having on state operations. In it, Lisa Benavidez, Human Resources Director for the Gambling Commission, pleaded with the governor's office saying, quote, "I feel it is important for you to see the impacts to small agencies," unquote. She describes how the vacancy rate for her agency is at 26%, driven in part by the vaccine requirement under the emergency. She goes on to say, We currently have recruitment difficulties when trying to fill our law enforcement positions. The vaccine mandate has made it even more difficult than normal. We cannot continue to lose employees." End quote. She feared staff burnout would lead to more staffing losses. This is a trade-off decision that would have benefited from legislative input. In a constitutional republic with a tradition of checks and balances, a wise governor would bring the legislature into the circle to consult on courses of action requiring trade-offs. Not only would the governor benefit from diversity of input, it would help build trust with the people to know their elected representatives were monitoring the process on their behalf in real time. Since there's no guarantee of the wisdom of future governors, we need emergency powers reform to restore the balance between the executive and the legislative branches. SB 5063 does not require a future governor to consult with legislative leaders on anything other than whether the state of emergency still exists, but that would at least be something worth adopting. There were many congratulations on the column, and I do much appreciate hearing the positive feedback. There was one exchange that was a bit different with someone who frequently disagrees, but always with civility and a focus on issues. So a shout out to Terry Gray, who asked this question. While I agreed with Inslee regarding the pandemic decisions, I understand the desire to allow for more input from other branches. I don't know the details of SB 5063 in terms of if it would require a supermajority to override a governor's veto. Also, do other states have a similar law? And Terry, those are really interesting questions. If the governor could veto such a vote to end his emergency powers, presumably he could veto that as well. But even if he could, then the legislature can, if it's in a mood to have a mind of its own, vote to override. There's at least a debate. As for how other states handle emergency powers, the best analysis that I've seen is from the Maine Policy Center, looking at all 50 states. We're not dead last, but they do rank us number 41 on their list. Terry replied, as expected, "Thanks for the info, but I don't put much stock in the Maine Policy Institute. It's certainly not nonpartisan." And he's right. It is seen as having somewhat of a partisan lean because it's a public policy center that's looking at free market solutions, just like the Washington Policy Center. However, their chart is the best chart that I've found, and it's really simple. You can go on there. I'll have a link in the Substack, and you can click on any state, and you can see just on some basic metrics how that state handles emergency powers, who could declare it, under what grounds it can be ended, what kind of input has to be taken from the legislature. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You can come to your own conclusions. In an interview with Brandy Cruz before the start of the legislative session, Senator Mark Mullet and Senator Linda Wilson both talked about the importance of having this in place, not looking at the past, but looking at future governors. And Senator Mark Mullet at that time alluded to Governor Inslee's pressure on his fellow Democrat senators as a roadblock to emergency power reform. And unfortunately, Senator Wilson reported last week that SB 5063 has already been killed by Democratic leadership. So this week, Brandy Cruz had a follow-up interview with a very frustrated Senator Mullet on why the Democrats killed emergency powers reform. And you'll find a link to that one on Substack as well. The bottom line is Governor Inslee doesn't want any limits on his power and is strong-arming Democrats to kill all attempts at even having a legislative debate on emergency powers reform by threatening to support primarying anyone who steps out of line, and by threatening to veto even bills like one which Senator Mullet described that it went through the Senate 49-0, total support from the Senate, passed through the House. Governor Inslee killed his bill because Senator Mullet, had the nerve to actually want to have a debate on emergency powers reform. And if that isn't a sign of petty tyranny and thin-skinnedness out of Governor Inslee, I don't know what is. So let me repeat from the column. 18 months into his declared state of emergency, Governor Inslee said this on the September 29, 2021 TVW program, The Impact. "There is only one person in the state of Washington who has the capability to save those lives right now, and it happens to be the governor of the state of Washington. A governor who speaks of himself in the third person with godlike powers is not someone acting with humility." And that right there is precisely why emergency powers reform is essential. We have no guarantee that any future governor will be able to act with any greater wisdom than our current governor. I will catch up with podcasts the next 2 weeks on two earlier columns. The January 5th column pointed out issues in the ambitious plans of our governor and other blue state governors to mandate a switch to electric vehicles by, the dates vary between 2030, 2035. Still, it's an ambitious schedule. I'm hoping to combine a reading of that column with an interview with the Avista executive who's tasked with figuring out where the power comes from for all this decarbonization, moving things onto the electric grid with mandated electric vehicles, mandated heat pumps, mandated electric stoves, and everything else that's being pushed onto an already stretched grid. The earlier December 27th column covered current controversies on the Twitter files with records released by Elon Musk to several different independent journalists. What's clear so far is information was manipulated in coordination with government sources on COVID and other hot topics in the 2020 to 2021 era of Twitter. More files are coming out weekly. I'm also starting to receive more files from my own public records request to the state of Washington on how they set COVID policy and vaccine policy. So there's going to be some interesting stuff to come in 2023. Thanks for listening. Hope you are already a subscriber, and if not, please consider subscribing and join me here on Substack for future Forthright podcasts.